Imagine a single ship arriving with soybeans enough to fill hundreds of freight trains, 300,000 tons, and everything on the paperwork says made in Argentina. The ship docks at Tianjin port, workers crane the first containers ashore, and then, surprise, Chinese customs publicly refuses the whole lot. They don't just delay it. They say, "This isn't Argentine soybeans. These are from the United States." That's the kind of opening that sounds like a spy movie, but it happened in real trade. Think of it like buying a phone boxed as brand A, only for a technician to open it and find brand B parts inside. The label tells one story, the contents tell another. Right away, you get the sense this is not a paperwork mistake, but a problem with money and motive. Someone stood to gain by disguising where the beans actually came from. In this section, we're not explaining every technical detail yet. Instead, we're planting the questions that will drive the whole video. Why would American soybeans be shipped as Argentine? How did customs figure it out? And what does a single rejected cargo do to farmers, traders, and entire countries? Next, we'll zoom out and show why soybeans matter so much to China, the stakes that make a single shipment worth the risk. To understand why this incident even matters, you first need to know how important soybeans are to China. With 1.4 billion people to feed, China is like a giant supermarket that never closes. But here's the problem. While China can produce enough rice, wheat, and corn for itself, soybeans are the weak spot. In 2024, China grew only about 20.6 million tons of soybeans. Sounds like a lot, right? But their actual demand was far higher. To cover the gap, China had to import about 105 million tons of soybeans. That's 2/3 of all its grain imports. Put another way, for every $100 China spends on grain from abroad, more than $70 goes just to buy soybeans. Why does China need so many? It's not because people are eating bowls of soybeans for dinner. Soy is mostly crushed into animal feed for pork, chicken, and fish, foods that middle-class Chinese families eat more of every year. It's also used to make cooking oil, which is essential in Chinese cuisine. In other words, soybeans are like the hidden ingredient keeping the country's food supply running. That's why China normally relies heavily on just two suppliers, Brazil and the United States. In 2024, nearly 70% of China's soybean imports came from Brazil, and another big chunk, over 22 million tons, came from the US. Argentina, with lower prices, has been growing its share too, reaching about 4 million tons that same year. So when a ship labeled Argentina shows up and customs suspects it's actually from the US, it's not just a labeling error. It's a direct challenge to the system China uses to secure food for over 1 billion people. And that's exactly why Beijing takes origin fraud so seriously. Now that we see how high the stakes are, let's go back to the April shipment and break down how China uncovered the deception step by step. Now let's walk through what happened that April day when the ship arrived at Tianjin port. On the surface, everything looked ordinary. The document said the soybeans were from Argentina. The sacks were labeled in Spanish. Even the shipping manifest matched what you'd expect from an Argentine export. But customs officers didn't just take the paperwork at face value. They ran their standard checks, and that's where things got interesting. First, they tested the soybeans' protein content. Normally, soybeans from Argentina have a protein level below 34% because of local soil and climate conditions. But this batch came back at 35.1%, a number that fits perfectly with American soybeans. That alone raised red flags, but customs went further. Inspectors looked at the sacks themselves and discovered they weren't Argentine at all. They had originally come from the United States. Imagine sending a package wrapped in U.S. Postal Service boxes but claiming it was mailed from another country. It was that obvious once they checked. At that point, the evidence stacked up. The numbers didn't match Argentina's profile, and the packaging betrayed the truth. Chinese customs concluded these were American soybeans disguised with Argentine paperwork. So instead of letting the cargo unload, they turned the ship away. 300,000 tons of soybeans rejected on the spot. And here's the key point. This wasn't the first time. Just a year earlier, in 2024, another shipment of 200,000 tons pulled the same trick, and customs exposed it within 48 hours. That's why Chinese inspectors have become especially alert to this kind of fraud. But how do they keep catching it? After all, traders aren't just relabeling, they're trying to outsmart entire governments. The answer lies in China's expanding forensic toolkit, science, data, and even artificial intelligence. And that's what we'll look at next. So how did China manage to see through the disguise? not just once but multiple times? The answer is that modern customs enforcement looks less like paperwork stamping and more like a CSI lab mixed with big data. First, there's protein testing. Just like wine from France tastes different from wine grown in California because of soil and climate, soybeans from each country have their own fingerprint. Argentine beans rarely cross 34% protein, while American beans often hit above that. It's a small detail, but it's enough to raise suspicion. Next comes trace element analysis, using high-precision mass spectrometers. These machines can detect tiny mineral differences in the beans, like checking the watermarks on a banknote. It's almost impossible for exporters to fake that. Then there's shipping data analysis. Customs tracks the GPS routes of freighters. If a ship supposedly carrying Argentine soybeans has a suspicious stop in a U.S. port, or its travel pattern doesn't line up with normal trade routes, that's another red flag. Even the packaging gets inspected. In this case, sacks traced back to the U.S. became one of the most direct pieces of evidence. It's a reminder that fraud isn't just in the cargo. It can slip in through the smallest details. To tie it all together, China upgraded its AI traceability system in 2024. Officials claim it can now cross-check up to 12 different indicators with 98% accuracy. Combine that with blockchain records, essentially digital birth certificates for soybeans from Brazil, and you get a system where every shipment story can be verified from farm to port. The message is clear? Fake documents alone don't stand a chance against a web of scientific tests, digital tracking, and advanced algorithms. And that leaves us with the big question. If the risks of being caught are so high, why would American soybeans be disguised as Argentine in the first place? That's where economics and politics collide, and it's our next stop. At this point, you might be wondering, if China has such advanced systems, why would anyone even try to sneak U.S. soybeans through under a false label? Well, the answer comes down to money and survival. Here's the backdrop. After Trump returned to office, Washington slapped massive tariffs on Chinese goods. Beijing hit back with tariffs of its own, including soybeans. Overnight, American soybeans became far more expensive for Chinese buyers. Think of it like adding a huge extra tax that makes your product sit on the shelf while competitors sell out. For U.S. farmers and exporters, this was devastating. Soybeans are one of their biggest exports, and China is the world's #1 buyer. When the door to that market slammed shut, they were left with giant stockpiles and falling prices. Imagine running a store with your biggest customer locked out. You'd be desperate to find a workaround. That's where Argentina enters the story. With lower prices and fewer trade restrictions, Argentina became a convenient middleman. Some U.S. traders saw an opportunity to ship beans down to South America, repackage them as Argentine, and then send them on to China. On paper, it looked clean. In reality, it was a gamble, hoping China wouldn't notice the swap. And the logic wasn't unique. Similar tricks were tried through Brazil as well, sometimes mixing U.S. soybeans with local crops to blur the origin. The hope was that once beans were in new bags with new certificates, they could slip past Chinese inspections. But here's the flaw. With customs now running protein tests, GPS analysis, and even blockchain checks, the disguise was bound to fail. What looked like a clever loophole ended up being a costly miscalculation. And the fallout didn't just stop with the rejected beans. It set off a much bigger chain reaction, one that reached farmers in Argentina, global trade organizations, and even sparked new international rules. That's what we'll dive into next. When China rejected those soybeans, the consequences didn't just hit U.S. traders. Argentina suddenly found itself caught in the middle of a geopolitical tug-of-war it hadn't asked for. For Argentine exporters, the situation was embarrassing. Even though many of them weren't directly involved, the scandal created doubt about whether Argentine soy shipments could be trusted. Think of it like buying a gold necklace only to find out it's been mixed with fake metal. You'd start questioning every seller in that market. That doubt had real costs. China, being Argentina's biggest soybean customer, slowed down purchases, demanded stricter verification, and pushed for tighter trade documents. This meant delays, higher costs, and reputational damage for honest Argentine farmers who had nothing to do with the scheme. Meanwhile, the scandal also forced global trade regulators to step in. Organizations like the World Trade Organization, or WTO, began discussing stricter transparency rules for agricultural exports. Some countries even pushed for blockchain-based tracking systems, so every shipment could be traced from farm to ship to buyer. And here's where it ripples out further. Countries in South America worried they might become dumping grounds for disguised U.S. products, while nations in Africa and the Middle East, who also buy soybeans, started demanding stronger guarantees too. What began as one ship of soybeans became a story about trust in global trade. It highlighted how one act of deception can tarnish entire supply chains, especially when the world's second-largest economy is involved. But the biggest shift wasn't just about Argentina's reputation or stricter paperwork. It was about China itself. The scandal gave Beijing a powerful reason to accelerate its long-term plan, reducing dependence on U.S. agriculture altogether, and that's where the story really turns. The soybean scandal didn't just expose fraud. It pushed China to double down on a strategy it's been quietly building for years, making sure its food supply can't be used against it. Here's why soybeans are such a big deal. China's livestock industry, especially pigs and poultry, depends heavily on soybean meal for animal feed. For decades, the United States was the main supplier. At one point, more than 60% of U.S. soybean exports went straight to China. That gave Washington enormous leverage, something Beijing saw as a weakness. So after these smuggling incidents, China moved faster to cut that dependency first. It expanded deals with Brazil, which has become China's top soybean partner. Brazil now ships more than double what the United States sends, and Beijing has invested in Brazilian ports and railroads to make those exports smoother. Second, China began investing in domestic substitutes. Scientists are pushing to use alternative feeds like rapeseed meal and fermented grain to replace soybeans in animal diets. The government has even set official targets to cut soybean use per pig by 5 to 10% within the next few years. Third, China started buying farmland abroad. From Russia's Far East to parts of Africa, Chinese companies are leasing land to grow soybeans directly under Chinese control. This way, Beijing isn't just buying crops, it's owning the supply chain from soil to port. And finally, these scandals gave Beijing the political justification to say, see, U.S. soybeans aren't reliable. They're expensive, risky, and even arrive under false labels. That narrative helped Chinese leaders rally domestic support for long-term food security projects. In short, what began as a shipping trick turned into fuel for Beijing's bigger agenda, building a future where American farmers no longer hold the keys to China's food supply. But this shift doesn't just reshape farming, it also changes global power dynamics, and the United States is starting to feel those effects. That's where we turn next. For American farmers, soybeans aren't just another crop, they're a lifeline. The United States exports over $20 billion worth of soybeans each year, and China used to buy the lion's share. So when tariffs and trade wars cut off access to that market, it wasn't politicians in Washington who felt the pain first. It was farmers in Iowa, Illinois, and Minnesota. Picture this. Giant silos filled with unsold soybeans, prices dropping to levels that barely cover the cost of production, and farmers scrambling for new buyers in markets that simply aren't big enough to replace China. Some turned to Europe, others to Mexico or Southeast Asia. But none of those markets came close. And the losses aren't just economic, they're generational. Farming in America is often a family business passed down over decades. When trade wars slash demand, it's not just about one bad season. It threatens whether the next generation can even stay on the land. Here's the bigger irony. While Washington tried to use tariffs as a weapon against Beijing, it ended up pushing China closer to Brazil and other suppliers. Today, Brazil dominates the Chinese soybean market, while U.S. farmers, who once had a secure, booming trade relationship, are now left fighting for scraps. Yes, the U.S. government offered subsidies to soften the blow, but subsidies are a band-aid, not a solution. They don't fix the fact that China, once the most important customer, is actively building a future without American soy. So the United States is stuck in a tough spot. Keep up the trade fight and risk losing farmers' loyalty at home, or back off and accept a weaker hand in negotiations with Beijing. Either way, the soybean saga shows how quickly a policy in Washington can ripple down to the soil of Midwestern farms. And this ripple doesn't stop at farmers. It stretches into diplomacy, global alliances, and even the future of trade wars themselves. That's where we'll head next. The soybean scandal is more than just a story about mislabeled cargo. It's a window into how trade wars are reshaping the global economy. Here's the reality. When two superpowers like the United States and China weaponize tariffs, the effects don't stay between them. They spill across borders, pulling in countries that weren't even part of the fight. Argentina and Brazil suddenly became battlegrounds, not because they wanted to, but because traders used them as loopholes. And this isn't limited to soybeans. The same dynamics are playing out in technology, energy, and even rare earth minerals. One country blocks, another reroutes, and global supply chains bend under the pressure. Every time that happens, trust erodes just a little more. What makes this dangerous is that global trade depends on trust. If buyers can't believe what's on the label, or if they worry about sudden tariffs, they start looking for long-term alternatives. That's exactly what China is doing, building a system where it relies less on the United States and more on allies like Brazil, Russia, and parts of Africa. For the United States, this is a warning sign. Every time Washington tries to tighten the screws with tariffs, it risks accelerating a trend it may not be able to reverse. The creation of parallel trade systems that cut America out. And here's the takeaway. Soybeans might seem like a small piece of the puzzle, but they represent something much bigger. They show how fragile global supply chains are when politics enters the mix, and how quickly today's trade war can turn into tomorrow's permanent realignment. Which brings us to the final question. After all this, what lessons can we actually take away? That's what we'll close with next. The soybean scandal may sound like a niche trade dispute, but when you step back, it reveals something much larger: the hidden cost of mistrust in global trade. For China, the lesson was clear. Never be too dependent on one supplier, especially a rival. That's why it's diversifying imports, developing alternatives, and even growing soybeans abroad. For the United States, the lesson was harsher. Policies made in Washington can backfire on the very people they claim to protect, leaving farmers stranded and markets slipping away. For countries like Argentina and Brazil, the scandal showed both opportunity and risk. On one hand, they gained business as China turned away from the United States. On the other hand, even the hint of fraud put their reputations on the line, reminding them that in global trade, trust is everything. And for the rest of the world, it's a warning. When trade wars escalate, everyone pays. Consumers, farmers, and businesses alike. Prices rise, supply chains break, and clever tricks to get around the rules only lead to stricter enforcement and deeper mistrust. So the real takeaway is this: soybeans were never just about food. They became a symbol of power, dependency, and the shifting balance in a world where economics and politics are now tightly intertwined. The next time you see headlines about tariffs or trade disputes, remember the rejected ship at Tangenport. It wasn't just 300,000 tons of beans. It was a signal that the rules of global trade are changing, and those who fail to adapt may find themselves left behind.